Hello and welcome everyone to the panel titled Pretrial Justice in a Pandemic. My name is Schuster with the Pew Charitable Trust, and thank you for tuning in. I think you're going to find this panel really fascinating and really relevant. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started, this is a pre-recorded session, so if there is more recent news that we don't talk about, please don't read any intention into that. We will catch up with you in the chat. Today, our panelists are Kristie Puckett-Williams from the ACLU of North Carolina, Cherise Fanno Burdeen from the Pretrial Justice Institute, and Mark Levin. I'm going to ask everybody, each in that order, Kristie, Cherise, and then Mark, to tell us quickly about yourself and how you came to be involved in policy discussions about pretrial justice.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'm a person that's directly impacted by the pretrial system here in North Carolina, and so I ended up at the policy table really by accident. I just was speaking out against what I saw and what I knew was happening, and found myself being pulled into policy tables and learning more about why these policies were in place on a different level than what I knew from just being held on pretrial.
I have been at the Pretrial Justice Institute for about 14 years, and so I came into the policy space talking about pretrial. I had previously done work on reentry, and I noticed that the three things people needed to get reattached to were jobs, housing, and family, and those are the three things we were taking away from people right when we booked them into jail. So that's why I've stayed at the table.
Yeah, I'm Mark Levin. I started the criminal justice program at the Texas Public Policy Foundation way back in 2005. And then that later became the Right on Crime Initiative as well, our national brand, in 2010. And I developed the concept for that, and we've been kind of spreading the message, particularly to right audiences, about the need to address many aspects of criminal justice reform, but including very much pretrial justice.
Thanks so much. So Mark, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to do some table sitting. So some of the basics, walk us through the stages and decisions in an average criminal case, starting from the point a person has been arrested.
Well, certainly, and of course, one of the real priorities is to perhaps arrest fewer people and give police more tools, such as police diversion programs, which we can talk about. And potentially using other systems when appropriate in terms of mental health and so forth. So, but once somebody is arrested and brought to jail, what typically happens is if there's a hearing soon to determine whether they'll be released. Ideally, what should happen is there should be a determination whether someone falls into the category of it's a very small segment of people that are so dangerous that they should stay in jail prior to trial, which, in our current system, it can be many months, sometimes more than a year before someone goes to trial. So that's a very weighty decision. And then after that in-out decision is made, the decision should be what conditions of release, which could include, obviously in many places, financial conditions, which might be posting money with the county. Of course, with commercial bail, typically you give 10% to the bail bondsman and of the total amount that's set, but also many other conditions, whether it's reporting or now text messaging to remind people of their court date. But the main problem that's come about is that bail, instead of its historical purpose as a method of release, has become a method of, and it's a de facto method of detention. In other words, if you can't afford a certain amount, sometimes which is listed on an arbitrary bail schedule, then you just stay in jail and you don't have the ability to appeal that. And of course, obviously it has a very disparate effect based on how much money someone has. So that's kind of the way it works now. And of course, the result is there's a lot of people who sit in jail because they can't afford bail. And on the other hand, there's a much smaller number who are very dangerous but are able to be released because they're wealthy.
So picking up on this same thread about bail and how it's generally used, this question is for Cherise. What is the purpose of bail? And is it generally used in a way that serves that purpose?
So sometimes people think this is splitting hairs, but bail and bond are not the same thing. So bond is the financial payment of a money bail. But the traditional sense of bail, and when folks talk about bail being enshrined in the Bill of Rights, the right against excessive bail, they often think that means money. But bail really is the contract between the person who's been accused of a crime and the court as to what conditions the court will be affording them their pretrial liberty. So money bond or money bail is just one of those kinds of things. The original intent of bail was to assure people's appearance at court. And if you think about 1820 or 1720 versus 2020, what we were mostly concerned about in colonial days was people getting on horseback and fleeing to way to the other side, and they wouldn't come back for trial. That isn't really the case today. So the original purpose of bail was to make sure folks appeared in court. In the late 80s, we saw the addition of dangerousness or public safety, both as a talking point and in statute. And so now a judge is trying to make a determination about the likelihood someone will appear in court and do so without picking up a new charge. That's the textbook definition of the purpose of bail. There was a book written long ago called The Process is the Punishment, and really sort of describes how having a bond placed on you that you cannot afford keeps you incarcerated. It makes you much more likely to take the plea deal offered you by the prosecutor's office. Typically, it will happen 30 or 60, 90 days in when you've served sometimes more time than what the law would have allowed a judge to sentence you to. And you're being offered a deal to go home today simply for pleading guilty. So we see a lot of coercive plea deals sort of arise out of pretrial detention. So you sort of have to wonder what the current purpose of bail is, if it's not simply about trying to handle the volume of cases we're trying to shove through the system, having expanded police, but not also expanded courts to the same degree. So it's become an efficiency measure.
So building on this, maybe Kristie, I can come to you. Any additional thoughts about the purpose of bail, how bail is currently being used before we move on?
Sure. I think if you are using bail to disconnect people from their power, especially Black, brown, and poor people from their power, then it does an incredibly effective job of doing that. That is the purpose, in my opinion, of bail, is to keep especially Black bodies enslaved. We know that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for those who have been convicted of a crime. And so the pressure to plead guilty is exponentially increased when you are being held in a bond that you cannot afford. And so bail does greatly impact Black, brown, and poor people in ways today that we have not seen in the past. People are losing their homes, their children, their jobs, all in the midst of a pandemic. And this was happening before the pandemic, but especially now in the midst of a pandemic, those things are continuing to happen and are have a greater risk than what they've had in the past.
Now, Kristie, I want to stay with that theme and that question and sort of call out that even before the protests across the country in response to the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, many reform advocates have been saying there is no pretrial justice without racial justice. Break that down for us. What does that mean?
So basically what it means is that if you go into any courtroom across this country, the majority of those courtrooms, you'll see Black and brown people in that courtroom. And so Black and brown neighborhoods are over-policed. We see police presence in Black and brown neighborhoods through methods of what we call broken window policing. So very minor crimes, traffic violations, people are being caught into the system based on very minor issues. And so mostly those are Black people and brown people. And so you can't have the conversations about pretrial justice without having it through the lens of racial justice, because Black and brown people are disproportionately affected. And historically, when we talk about poor people, we're synonymously talking about Black and brown people as well.
And Cherise, the Pretrial Justice Institute has recently made a move to make racial justice more central to their work. Can you tell us more about how you think about this?
Yeah, certainly. So, you know, we've, for the last 25 years, we actually also had been involved in a youth justice initiative called the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative from the Casey Foundation. And if you look at the amazing outcomes from that initiative over the last couple of decades, you've seen a dramatic decrease in the number of youth arrested, and you've seen a very significant decrease in the number of youth detained. But what you haven't seen is any budge in racial disparities. And so now, even if there are only a handful of kids in a detention center, they are much, much more likely to be Black and brown kids. So what we knew at PJI was that that the use of these sort of tools and reforms to try to get at, which we bought into hook, line, and sinker, and we're out proselytizing about risk assessment and supervision. If you just get rid of money bond, you put in these other things, everything is going to be amazing and rainbows. Even though we knew on the kids' side that wasn't working, somehow we were going to make that work on the adult side. So for us, the lens of racial justice means and it's a whole longer story about our own racial equity work at PJI, but I guess what I really want to say about it is when Black lives matter, all lives matter. And so the notion of looking at something through a racial equity lens means that all people will be treated equitably, all people will be treated fairly. And so for us, what we're trying to figure out is how do you operationalize wins where you don't have to sacrifice anyone?
So we're going to be getting more into talking about COVID-19 and the current conversation nationally around policing. Before we get there, we still have some more table setting to do. So Cherise, I'm going to stick with you on this one. Across the country for the last 6 or 7 years, people detained on unaffordable money bond have been suing courts and sheriffs, and they've been winning those cases. So in broad brushstrokes, tell us, what are they arguing in those cases?
And my disclaimer is I do not have law school debt, so I'm not a lawyer. So in layman's terms, courts have been entertaining lawsuits, class action lawsuits brought against the county, saying that people are being treated differently under the law. And so in our Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause, both the fact that if Kristie's given $50 bond and I'm given $50 bond and she can't make it and I can, then we're being treated differently under the law, simply due to our ability to pay. And in the fines and fees case law, there already had been precedent around people could not be incarcerated due to an inability to post a fine or a fee. So these brilliant lawyers drug those ideas into the bail space to say, isn't money bond sort of a similar process? And for any kind of legal nerds out there, the court ruling in the O'Donnell case in Harris County, did I get that right? O'Donnell? Yeah, the Harris County case is an amazing digestion of all of the legal arguments against pretrial detention, in particular, due to an inability to pay. And so that litigation is really having a lot of reverberations because it's expensive to get sued. I think Harris County spent $8 or $9 million defending itself in that lawsuit. So those opinions are being able to be spread around the country, and people are saying, gosh, I don't want to get sued. Would our bail statutes and the way we practice bail in this jurisdiction withstand a constitutional challenge? So it's really amazing work.
Now, I'm going to ask both Mark and Cherise this next question. It's about jail growth. We saw in a relatively short period of time, about 35 years, jail populations across the country tripled. What drove that growth, as far as we can tell?
Well, and to amplify also what Cherise said, in Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, it was litigation about the misdemeanor bail system. And almost all of the individuals that were denied bail, or actually couldn't afford bail, they weren't denied bail, they couldn't afford their bail amount, they ended up getting probation. So the punishment was the process, as Cherise said. They had already spent this time in jail in which they lost employment and connections to family and housing, and then they ultimately got probation. So, and it created both the due process problem because, of course, the closed circuit hearing, or even when it was in person, they had almost no chance to state their case, no lawyer. And then obviously the other problem that was alluded to is equal protection. And I'm a free market guy. I believe if you have money, you should be able to buy a nicer car, a nicer home. But here we're not talking about that. We're talking about access to justice. So that kind of is the backdrop for that. Now, the question you raised about the growth in pretrial populations, which interestingly is occurring in recent years the most in rural areas. And that actually points to one of the causes, which I think is a lack of alternatives, a lack of treatment programs for people with mental illness and addiction. So the jail is the only option. Unaffordable money bail, of course, in many rural areas in particular don't even have pretrial services, which is often the main alternative to for someone who can't afford to pay whatever the monetary bail that is set is. which is typically a little like probation, except, of course, you haven't been found guilty. Those are some of the aspects we're dealing with. And then, I really think we have to look also at indigent defense, because there's been a number of studies which have shown that people that don't have rapid availability of quality counsel are at a disadvantage. There's no one advocating for a lower bail, for example, for them.
So Cherise, same question. What drove all this jail growth?
Well, lest Mark and I sound like we agree too much, I'll disagree with him here. So I actually, yes, all of those are some technical reasons for growth in jail population, but I would actually argue that it is the entire culture of our law and order nature that has really driven jail populations. And so, we produce 100,000 new laws a year. We love to put everything as a law that makes it available for arresting people. So what we know is that about 95% of the jail growth over the last several decades is just pretrial detention. So, so that notion of simply being able to arrest and book somebody into jail, the disagreement I'll have with Mark a little bit too is, yes, we definitely need viable alternatives for people who are suffering from public health related issues or circumstance issues, stealing food, stealing blankets. People don't do that if they can buy food or a blanket, right? So what is it that we're trying to sort of tuck away in jails, right? It's the part of our citizenry that is really struggling to meet their basic needs. And we should start to probably ask the question, why do we have so many people who are presenting themselves with mental health issues? And what is it about sort of the culture of poverty that really causes, and the culture of oppression that really is causing a lot of this stuff? And there are viable solutions. I will agree with you on that, Mark. There's lots we can do instead of jail.
So we're going to get more to that point in just a minute. Before we do, Kristie, assume that some folks in our audience don't really know what it's like to be in jail. How do people describe their time in jail, and what's it like?
I don't know about how people describe their time, but I will describe for you my time in jail. They're the darkest days of my life. I entered into the system as a young victim of domestic violence. And so the first time I was arrested as the victim. Because the police had come to my house so many times. They said they were tired of coming to my house. So maybe if they took me to jail, the fighting would stop, right? And so I entered into the system a battered and broken person, and was essentially beat down by that system as the victim of a violent crime. And so when you first come into the jail, so my hair is down now, it would be down inside of the jail because they would take all of the elastic hair ties from you. You are patted down by the officer who arrested you when you arrive at the jail. Then you are then patted down by a staff of the jail. You receive medical screenings. You take your fingerprints and your mugshot and all of those things. But I think the most dehumanizing part is your inability to control what happens to you in that setting. Like, you're definitely at the mercy. Let's just be clear, if you make it to jail. So many people die before they even make it to jail at the hands of state-sanctioned violence by the police. So if you are lucky to make it to jail, then the conditions inside of that jail could kill you because it is extremely cold in that jail. The food, I can't even describe to you the food, if that's what we call it. I think it's, I think it has nutritional value, but that's it. But I wouldn't call it food. It's slop. It's not even fit for your pigs or hogs, right? It is how people talk to you. You are a number. You are no longer Kristie Puckett. You are 07523, whatever this number is that they assign to you. And where you use the bathroom, what time you use the bathroom, how you talk to your family, when you talk to your family, when you lay down, when you get up, if you can get under the covers or not. And if you are a woman, how much access to sanitary napkins you have depends on that officer at that time. And so it can get really, really demoralizing, and you can be dehumanized and disconnected from your power simply by spending several hours inside of a jail, let alone people who spend days, weeks, and months and years inside of a carceral facility. It is literally the worst place on earth, and I wouldn't recommend it for my worst enemy.
Now, Kristie, I'm going to stick with you on this next question. Khalif Browder and Sandra Bland became household names about 5 years ago and helped draw national attention to pretrial policies. What was it about their stories and their experiences that grabbed people's attention?
I think most people could see themselves in Khalif Browder and in Sandra Bland. And most of us have been pulled over by the police. Here in North Carolina, if you're Black, you've definitely been pulled over by the police because our police are 62 times more likely to pull you over if you're driving while Black. So just in a regular traffic stop, a woman goes to jail on a $500 bond that she cannot afford, and she ends up dead. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old who was accused of taking a backpack. Okay, he was waiting for 3 years, y'all. 3 years. I think that's what connects with people the most. We've all been 16. We've all sped. We've all done stupid stuff, but we all have not sat inside of a jail cell in Rikers Island fighting for our life. I think that's what resonated with people. It was the youth that Khalif Browder had, and just that the system completely and utterly and totally failed him on every single turn. He was in one of the most dangerous jails in this country for theft of a book bag. I mean, that's, I believe, is why people were so incensed, and why his name and Sandra Bland's name continue to ring bells today, is because we knew, Black and brown communities have always known that police are our greatest enemy. But the mainstream America saw that 5 years ago, and we've continued to see it through the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Rashad Brooks in Atlanta.
So staying on this question for just a minute, Cherise or Mark, anything to add about the Sandra Bland story, the Khalif Browder story?
Yeah, I would add that, certainly ditto to everything that Kristie said. And Kristie, thanks for sharing your story about what it's like to be booked in. I think in addition to what she said, we're starting now more and more. I know we've had video of things that have happened for a long time, but the release of the video of Khalif's beatings in Rikers, the video of Sandra, I think video is connecting with people in a far different way than the Rodney King beating. I mean, that was like 30 years ago or something, y'all. It's a long time ago, right? 20 years ago. So I think being able to see it, I also think that we have a sense that somehow, Khalif got out. Yeah, it sucked he was in for 3 years, but he eventually got out. But to see the trauma that he went through and retelling his story over and over and over again be too much for him to bear, I think there's also something in that really woke people up to the notion that just getting out doesn't actually get your mind out.
Yeah, and if I could address, of course, Sandra Bland here in Texas, it was a terrible travesty of justice. She was signaling a lane change, actually to try to get out of the way from the officer, and she was pulled over for failure to signal a lane change. So she didn't signal. I guess she changed lanes without. But anyway, the officer, if you looked at the video, clearly escalated the interaction, which actually Malcolm Gladwell, it's what inspired him to write a new book on the failure to communicate. It's the first example he used. But then, of course, she went to jail, which is outrageous that you would be arrested for a fine-only traffic offense, and we're still trying to change that law in Texas. But then the jail didn't have the right protocols when it comes to dealing with people with mental illness. And she was a very smart lady. She was a professor. She was going to take a job at a historically Black college in Texas, and but she ended up hanging herself in that jail. And we did pass a bill working with lawmakers to approve protocols for dealing with people with mental illness in jail, but we still need to, hopefully in 2021, finally say that unless there's a breach of the peace or an urgent danger to the officer, we're not going to arrest people for fine-only traffic offenses. So, I think these cases have really brought this issue home to people across the country of every background. We obviously have believe that police can do much better, and that the vast majority of them want to do much better. And we need to give them more tools instead of just arresting people and bring them to jail.
So, Mark, we've heard some examples of people who shouldn't have gone to jail, or where there's sort of what broad consensus it didn't make sense for them to be in jail, or categories of people who don't make sense to be in jail? When do you think jail is necessary for public safety, and when does it do more harm than good? Where do you draw that line?
Well, it's a difficult question, especially in the pretrial context, because somebody hasn't been convicted yet. And so there's a few parts of it. I think from our standpoint, the most important issue is, in fact, public safety. Somebody who, and it's a very small segment of defendants who pose such a grave danger to the community that can't in any way be managed through all the tools, including technological tools we have now for supervising people pre-trial. And I want to say, I think Cherise alluded to this earlier, many people were best off not supervising at all. Do a text message alert, they're low risk. You know, anything we would do would just aggravate their lives and make things worse. But again, dealing with this very small segment, and we can all think of individuals that are detained because arrested for murder, and let's say they have prior violent offenses, or rape, the very serious things, domestic violence. And so we believe that the way to deal with that is a very carefully crafted preventive detention statute that, regardless of how much money they have, there is a situation where, with due process, they can be denied bail. And they can appeal that on a rapid basis. And there's got to be a stronger showing than probable cause, which is the standard for arresting someone. It's got to be, for example, clear and convincing evidence that they're in fact guilty of what they've been arrested for, in addition to posing such a grave danger.
Now, Kristie, where do you fall on this question? When do you think jail is necessary for public safety, and when does it do more harm than good?
Well, as a prison abolitionist, I never believe that jail is the answer. Safety derives from healthy relationships with other people. Jails and prisons are focused on isolation, and therefore they foster violence rather than foster safety. People are safe when they have what they need, when they are not desperate, when they have spaces to heal from their trauma, and when we are able as a community to prevent them from suffering trauma anyway. So we do need to build community safety and public safety, but we do that through making sure that people have what they need, and by building connected relationships in communities. I mean, we don't do that through cops and cages.
Cherise, how do you think about this?
So, you know, I think I probably, I mean, everything I say, I should have a little asterisk next to it, say, you know, subject to my further evolution, right? But today, whatever day today is, I'm sort of, I kind of feel a little bit like both Mark and Kristie. So I'm like so totally down with what Kristie is saying. And I know that there are plenty of places where that's a stretch, right, for the imagination. And we got to walk people towards that. The very tightly narrow focus of a detention net is something that I think needs articulated, because sometimes people will say, like maybe Mark just did, is it being charged with a serious violent offense, or is it someone that we have now decided is a high risk or is a danger, and how is that determined? And I think where we are at PJI is sort of where many of the other organizations have gotten to, which is that a charge of serious violence against another person is something that goes into that detention net. And if you look at places like New Jersey and the District of Columbia that actually host the hearings that Mark is talking about 15% of arrests qualify in that net. And then at that hearing, courts are ruling about half the time that there is something that can be done to make sure that that person comes to court without getting rearrested for something violent. So you're talking about a 6-7% detention rate. Could we get to 0? Let's work towards that. And what would we be like if we could, everybody in the country could get down to 6 or 7% detention rate? But not sacrificing a few for the good of the whole. What we say is, you know, if someone has caused a serious or is accused of a very serious violent thing, you know, it's not a mentally healthy person doesn't rape someone. And so is it a crime, or is it a mental health issue? And so those are sort of questions, you know, is jail the best place to keep that person pre-trial, or should they be immediately assessed for some kind of mental health evaluation and treatment? Not that you start treatment pre-trial, but you know what I'm saying, like a different system that would be addressing the violence that person is expressing, probably from underlying trauma.
Okay, so we are now about halfway through our panel time period, about half an hour in. Let's pivot. Let's talk about COVID-19 and how it has changed the landscape. So I'm gonna start with Kristie. Why are people in jail so vulnerable to COVID-19 exposure?
In jails and prisons, you are unable to regulate your own body. You do not have access to sanitizing agents or disinfectants. You know, your ability to clean is based on when the corrections officer provides you the cleaning materials. Alcohol and bleach and those things, sanitizing agents that we use here, those things are contraband inside of a carceral facility. You are in close proximity with people. So what the CDC recommends, social distancing, you're not able to do that inside of a jail or prison. Oftentimes there are 2 or 3 people inside of a cell the size of a parking space, right? And so how do you maintain social distance when you are cooped all in together? Not just that, they're not masked, they're not provided with protective equipment, personal protective equipment like masks and things like that. And if we look at prior to COVID, any communicable disease has always been overrepresented inside of a jail or a prison. So whether it's tuberculosis or hepatitis C, heart disease, diabetes, all of those issues, healthcare issues, are overrepresented in a prison population or a jail population. So we know that that's going to be exponentially so in the midst of the pandemic.
All right, now, Mark, since the COVID-19 outbreak in the United States, what kind of policy changes have we seen in the pretrial arena? What kind of practice changes have we seen?
Well, there's some really good news in this regard. First of all, of course, nationally, jail populations have fallen about 20%, and that's largely due to fewer people being detained prior to trial and fewer arrests. And in fact, street crimes have gone down quite a bit. Now, this is data prior to, you know, some of the reopenings that we've seen in many jurisdictions. But in addition to that, of course, a lot of jurisdictions have tried to implement testing, PPP, you know, protective gear in jails. And, you know, there's a lot of challenges in that. And of course, you've got staff that go home every night. And we've seen the data in terms of in Chicago, it's been cited that over 20% of the cases of COVID-19 in the community can be traced back to the Cook County Jail. About half the cases in a particular small town in Ohio were relating to the prison there. Now, one of the, I think the most encouraging things is the use of virtual hearings. And so we actually have some hard data, which is really exciting. So Michigan, in April, they used virtual check-ins, basically, in hearings for people that were on released, you know, prior to trial, and the failure to appear rate was 0.5% in April of 2020 versus 10.7% in April of 2019. That's like 20 times lower failure to appear rate. And New Jersey had the same thing, went down from 20% to 0.3% when they use these virtual hearings. So what that tells me is we've always seen in risk assessments, and we support the use of validated risk assessments so long as there's no socioeconomic proxies or racial proxies. Now, I realize that's difficult, and part of the thing we've said is take out like drug possession because it has overlap in terms of race, even though all races use drugs in the same amount. But beyond that, what part of the issue with these risk assessments is they include failure to appear. And wouldn't it be much better to say abscond, which means not, you know, showing up for 6 months or whatever the definition is? And it's precisely for this reason. All the research told us for many years that most people who fail to appear, 80 to 90% of them appear for a hearing within a month, for example, of the original hearing. They missed their hearing because they didn't have childcare, they didn't have transportation, they couldn't get off of work. And with these virtual hearings, with the data on these, we now see how right that was, the reasons why people weren't showing up to in-person hearings. So let's not just automatically revert. Let's take some parts of what we put in place during the pandemic and keep those.
Cherise, now I want to come to you and sort of ask again about good changes, bad changes since the COVID-19 outbreak, and specifically want to bring up the rollback of pretrial reforms in New York and get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to what Mark said, we are seeing many communities sort of reduce the number of custodial arrests and bookings. That's great. it's not all, when you take a national average, it might sound like everybody went down 20%, but that isn't true at all, right? You have some spaces where they've done amazing things, and then you have places where they've done nothing or gone on full lockdown and haven't sort of changed anything about their pretrial policies and practices. I also want to just throw out a little caution about anything. Yes, it's awesome that we're down to a 0.5% failure to appear rate. Taking a look at what we arrest, why we arrest, and why we're charging people with certain misdemeanors is something that we shouldn't lose inside of a reform that made it just much more efficient for us to convict people. So just want to put that out there. I really have struggled around the New York issue. New York is an example that we've seen over the last couple of years of rollbacks. There is what research is showing in terms of good public policy and good government practice with a racial equity lens. And then there's politics. And New York is a little bit like Alaska was last year, where when something changed in the political space, bail reform became a magnet for the cause of whatever the problem was. And so rollbacks on bail reform happened. And I just would draw a straight line back to culture change. When you do technical fixes without culture work, organizational culture work, and ask deeper questions about why and who we arrest, who we arrest and why, you'll see technical fixes rolled right back as the political winds change. So Californians, for example, will go to the ballot this November and decide on cash bail in California. And the Supreme Court in California just issued an opinion reversing itself, taking away the $0 cash bail they implemented during COVID. And unless COVID is completely gone in California and they've built a wall, California is not immune to COVID. And so bail reform just sort of is an easy target when these things, it's why actually also New Jersey has held tight, because New Jersey did the work of culture change, not just technical fixes. And I think that's why we're seeing it sort of stick in New Jersey.
So let's stick with this theme of culture change and think about so many of the unknowns around COVID-19. We don't know how long it's going to be with us. We don't know if it's going to morph into something more dangerous. We don't know how many peaks and valleys we may have for how long. Given some uncertainty, but some opportunity here for sustained changes in practice because of COVID-19, what are the opportunities for culture change, or what does it look like to go from temporary change to more lasting change? Cherise.
I think it's, in many ways, what's happening with COVID has brought front and center the impacts of a lot of our public policy in healthcare, in environmental justice, and culture change really in any of these systems, education, all of it, is really about valuing this sort of hierarchical nature of whose life matters more. And I think when we have a conversation about all we can do to make sure everybody has at least the basic opportunities in life and the basic access to care, we can talk about culture change. Sometimes just pointing out racial disparity and overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system, for example, as Mark knows, most of the country is rural. And in those rural jurisdictions, we're seeing increasing jail populations. And so in places where poor white folks are also, their liberty is tied up completely with Black and brown people. And so really having a conversation about our cultural values around fair distribution of resources is really something that it isn't easy to have, but us white folks have to start talking to other white folks about stuff like that.
more on this point to add from Mark or Kristie about what's it going to take to sustain changes that are happening during COVID-19?
Well, in particular, New Jersey, that Cherise mentioned, is a great example because, you know, they did spend considerable money, $10 million, training judges, implementing technology. So it was very well planned. And, you know, and I know there's some disagreement about the extent to which some people may need to be on pretrial supervision and we need to have services, including mental health. But I think that certainly they created that infrastructure. And I think that was one of the major advantages of what they did. You know, one thing we didn't hit on earlier, which kind of resonated with part of what Cherise said, is the different types of bail. Now you have, again, and this isn't to say you need to necessarily use any financial conditions, especially for most people. Probably for the people it makes the most sense are white-collar people who have a huge ability to flee to another country, and they can turn in their passports, or they can post, you know, some access to their bank account with the county. And then the feds use this more because you have more white-collar defendants at the federal level. But the interesting part is obviously, you know, if you give collateral or something to the county, you have to have something to give. Now, there's also unsecured bail where you sign something saying, if I don't show up, I'm going to agree to pay this. But again, as Cherise said, you know, one of the reasons we're here is a lot of defendants don't have any resources, and that's also why we end up talking about indigent defense and how important that is. All of this, and it's part of what we're dealing now with policing. We're laying everything at the feet of police, but we have a lot of societal challenges, whether it's race or poverty, that police, you know, are just one aspect of that. So I do think it is important to have these broader discussions.
Kristie, anything to add?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, so why don't we bring this conversation even more into the present day? There's a new national attention on police practices. In just the last several weeks, public opinion has taken a major shift around policing in America. Kristie, tell us what has changed and what sort of policy discussions are now taking place?
I think much to the point that Cherise made earlier about video, we have watched several people, Black people, white people, we watched hundreds of people be killed by the police in this country. I think what we saw with the latest video with George Floyd was the indifference that that officer had to the people who were pleading for him to get off of George Floyd's neck. I think when that officer put his hand in his pocket and seemed to relax and had a slight smirk on his face, it was clear to everyone that it was not about what was right or what was wrong. It was about submission and control in that moment. And so I think what we poor Black people have known forever, mainstream America is starting to see. Like even the Starbucks drinking people who are like just the whitest of the white people are like, oh my God, the police are horrible, right? And these are people who have been oblivious for their entire lives to how bad the police are. And now they're like, oh my God, they're trying to figure out how they can make Molotov cocktails, right? And it's because through the power of social media, that video and those several different videos I think were powerful. But as we saw Rayshard Brooks, we watched Rayshard Brooks, the intoxicated man in Atlanta. The police talked to him for 40 minutes. They were very jovial with him, very nice. And as soon as they started to arrest him and he struggled, they went from very nice to very nasty, ended up shooting him in the back twice, right? And so I believe that America has shifted because it's been forced to recognize what has always been right there in front of its face, that our liberation is all connected. I am not free if we're not all free, much to Cherise's point there. So the poor white people who are opiate addicts, who are out in whatever rural territory they're in, their liberation is directly tied to my liberation in the hood here in Charlotte, North Carolina, because the tactics that the police use on me, they will damn sure use on you. And I think what's really surprising to people is that I've been protesting for the last 2 weeks. I've been arrested twice in these last 2 weeks. I've been shot by pepper bullets, pepper spray, tear gas, in an incident on June 2nd, 2 weeks ago today, that I almost died along with 300 other people peacefully protesting at the hands of the brutality of the police. We're literally protesting police brutality, and the police are brutalizing us as we protest their brutality. Right? And not just that, I think it's the realization that the police have been operating with impunity for so long. They have qualified immunity, right? Or qualifying immunity. And so what we've been saying in our community is there is no qualified immunity. in the community, you will be held accountable. And that accountability looks very different across the board. There are people who believe that if an officer kills us, then we need to kill some officers. There are people who believe that, right? And at this point, I ask everyone on this call who watches this, what do you suggest that we do? We have kneeled, we have prayed, we have sang, we have marched, we have begged, we have pleaded, we have researched, we have done everything that has been asked of us in order to have our full rights of citizenship, and yet we are still treated like second-class citizens. So I'm open to suggestions if anybody has any. Tweet me at Kristie_1979, because I am really looking to the solution to how do we get police to see Black and brown people as being worthy of the de-escalation tactics that they use and that they seemingly reserve on white people. We saw Dylan Roof be offered a burger in the back of a car after he had killed 9 Black people. And we see Black people who are running away from the police be shot down in their backs. And so I think America is having to come to terms with our history of white supremacy. And that white supremacy has just bubbled up so that we are being forced to recognize it. So to answer your question about the policies though, so as a result of that attack on peaceful protesters, the city council here in Charlotte decided to defund chemical agents in our financial budget for next year for the police. So the police in here are no longer able to buy any chemical agents such as tear gas and flashbangs and all of those militarized things that they use. And so I think when people hear defund, they get really sensitive and think, oh my God, we're defunding the police. I like to use the word reallocate. We need to reallocate the money that we use to control and surveil to provide people with their basic needs so that we can create the public safety, the container for the public safety that we so desperately want to see.
So Kristie brings up qualified immunity and reallocating funding. I'm going to turn to Mark. What other policy ideas seem up for discussion now that weren't up for discussion a month ago, and how do you think policymakers are reacting to them?
Well, I think certainly I kind of begin from law and order and try to unpack that. And we have thousands of laws. One of the issues we deal with is overcriminalization. We have more laws than we can count, but we don't really have that much order. So what's the bridge between law and order? It's legitimacy. What allows people to be peaceful while they wait for justice? Because justice takes time in a particular case or passing laws. That's legitimacy, because people will believe that not just the police, but the whole system will produce a just outcome. So legitimacy is what has been missing, particularly in certain communities relative to the police and the system more broadly. We have a crisis of wrongful convictions that undermines legitimacy. As far as solutions, certainly in the context of police de-escalation, training to improve communication skills for officers. So many of these incidents, you don't see, for example, even in the one in Atlanta, the officer never said why he was handcuffing that guy. And so that creates a real suspicion. And again, it's not, many officers are good people, but if they don't have the right training, they're not going to be able to handle these situations in a way that avoids the necessity of using force. We've also, my colleague, Randy Peterson, who heads our policing program, published a great paper on physical fitness standards for officers, because they're more likely to use other forms of force if they're not in good shape. The police unions in Texas and elsewhere have opposed that. They also were the ones who killed our bill to stop arresting people for fine-only offenses. So one of the other things, I agree we need to rein in qualified immunity, and then finally look at things like co-responding, where an officer arrives with a mental health counselor. Now that's not to say you can't have certain situations where you don't even need the police, where you have, like in Connecticut, 14 mobile health crisis units, that it's a civilian function, it's not the police involved. But there are many situations involving people with mental illness where it could spiral out of control. But if the first person talking to them is a counselor with the right training, then the officer is just a backup in case there's a problem. So there's so many things we can do. We believe most police want to do the right thing, but they certainly need the tools and the training.
Now, I'm going to turn to Cherise. Please add anything to that conversation that you'd like, but also I'd like to help connect the dots for our audience. How does policing impact pretrial justice? And how does police reform affect the rest of the justice system?
Sure. Well, often when we go into jurisdictions to talk about their pretrial justice system, we often hear, well, we're in receipt of whoever the police bring to the jail, to the courts. And so police really are, they're the gateway from the street to the system. And so police play a huge role in this. They have enormous discretion. And whether or not someone is given a citation in lieu of arrest or a summons sort of will depend on how polite you were to the police officer in addition to what you look like. And I think, you know, I started in this work in the 90s, right around the time the crime bill was passed. And right sort of under our noses, right, we've militarized a portion of our justice system. We haven't militarized defenders, public defenders. We haven't militarized prosecutors, but we have militarized the police. And you see that when you see the National Guard being deployed and people are astounded, or even like after 9/11 when you saw guards, police in airports with semi-automatic rifles. It was a strange sense of like having a military presence in our airports, if you'll all remember that. But that's on the streets all the time. And so I think that policing impacts pretrial significantly because it's about the volume of people that are brought to the jail in the first place. It also impacts, for better or worse, people's lack of procedural justice throughout the system. It has an outlet somewhere, and it's going to be on the portion of the criminal justice system that they're the most proximate to, and that's the police. The last thing I sort of want to say about this is that police reform definitely impacts pretrial justice, because if cops all of a sudden do drug raids, or if they all of a sudden do these sort of maneuvers that would cause an increase in the bookings in the jail, then any sort of reform that is sort of about the normal processing of things gets pushed to the side while a volume comes in. And you see that with protests. The way we are policing and arresting and incarcerating people who are being arrested for peaceful protesting. Our person in Cincinnati referred to a bunch of folks getting put on city buses, and the buses were parked behind the police station for like 8 hours, no bathrooms, no food, no formal booking process, just people who had been taken off the streets under the auspices of being arrested. That is not a normal process by any means. And even if that was a reformed jurisdiction with an amazing pretrial justice system, that would be pushed pause while we deal with this heavy volume. So police have a lot to do with this, and policing reform can sort of impact it dramatically. And then just one thing I want to say about public opinion to Kristie's, just to elevate Kristie's point. People of color's public opinion about police hasn't changed an iota. But when we do national polling, and we have, you know, we say we're sampling well in lots of different communities, I bet if you sort of just focused on white people's public opinion about policing, that's really what Kristie was sort of noting, that like, it's really our opinion that's changing. And one thing I really think about that is I have a 17-year-old son who has tons of friends on Xbox that he's never seen in his life, but who are from all over the world and lots of different colors. And his notion of what's fair and the way we grown-ups have sort of messed things up, I think has a lot to do with people my age's public opinion, because, you know, I am a suburban, regular, you know, white girl, but my kid is like, Mom, what are you doing? So I think our public opinion is being influenced by our kids' access to social media in a way that has sort of broken down segregation in a way that geography hasn't.
Now we're in the last 6 or 7 minutes of our panel. As we wrap things up today, we're going to end with some calls to action. We're at a really unique moment in time. There's already momentum in pretrial justice reform, and that momentum now has these new layers of relevance and urgency. The question for all three of you, starting with Cherise and then Mark, and then Kristie will get the last word, is what would you like to see policymakers do now? How can the members of our audience help? So what is your call to action to shrink the system?
I only get one, right? That's so unfair, Terry. So I think a huge move is in non-custodial arrests for misdemeanor charges and non-person related felony charges. If we can avoid booking people in jail, I don't have to talk about the calls to action for all the reforms that would be necessary after that. And you only gave me one.
Mark?
Well, and to name a certain example of that, to build on what Cherise said, is, the LEAD program in Seattle, which has been replicated in Colorado and elsewhere, where police in certain low-level drug cases, as well as certain prostitution cases, the individual, and many are homeless, many have been involved in the justice system many times before, but never gotten any services. They're passed off to a caseworker, and there's emergency housing, and there's a range of outcomes. And we put out a publication talking about how much it's reduced emergency room costs, jail costs, and obviously the human toll of those. So I think that, as we look more broadly, we are concerned that kind of we're having the wrong discussion sometimes now, because even things like LEAD, not in this discussion, but nationally, even programs like LEAD do require some police resources. And so it's really not about the money. It's more about focusing on how can we produce better outcomes and honor the dignity of every person. And so the final thing I'll say is we need to focus at the local and state level. I also am a bit concerned that we federalize too much. But the bottom line for us in pretrial is let's have a system based on public safety, due process, and presumption of innocence, not based on ability to pay.
And Kristie, what is your call to action to shrink the system?
Sure. So as a person who is formerly incarcerated, who now sits at policy tables, I hope that people who have the opportunity to sit at policy tables, who are already at the table, are able to make space for people like me. People like me, the people who are closest to the problem, are truly closest to the solutions, but we're oftentimes farthest from the resources and the power. So my call to action is to make the resources and the power available to the people who are most proximate to the issue. If you have some privilege, whether it's white privilege, legal privilege, whatever privilege you have, make it available to the most marginalized people. If it's male privilege, make it available to the most marginalized people in your community. It doesn't diminish your voice or your advocacy when you do that. It actually increases your leadership and makes you a really good leader when you're able to bring people along, develop leaders after you. Because listen, at some point, I'm going to be the old fart at the table who doesn't know policy anymore. Right? Who doesn't know what's the new poppin' thing because I'm so far removed. And so my job is to make sure that there are people coming behind me who are going to keep that fresh perspective, who are going to keep pushing for radical change so that we can get the public safety that we so desperately need in this country.
All right. Thank you, Kristie. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Cherise, so much for participating in this panel. And thanks to our audience members for tuning in. You can get in touch with any of us through the conference organizers, and please do. So thank you so much for your time. Hope you enjoy the other panels at the conference, and have a great day, everyone.